How do ordinary Africans benefit from the yearly African Union gatherings? How relevant is the 2015 Women Empowerment and Development theme? What are some of the key challenges currently facing this continent? And is the African Union well equipped to tackle the mounting Islamic militant threat? What time is it? It's question time. Hello and welcome to the show. My name is Mpho Tsedu. The world's largest business forum held in Davos, Switzerland, ended over the weekend with most delegates expressing concerns around Africa's Islamist threat, the Ebola virus, and the slow growth among Africa's top trade and investment partners. The current 24th African Union Summit, being held in the Ethiopian capital Addis Ababa, has been themed 2015, Year of Women's Empowerment and Development towards Africa's Agenda 2063. Similar to the Davos Summit, peace and security issues as well as the need to intensify women empowerment and youth employment are some of the key focus areas at the current AU gathering. My guests, Aisha Kaji, who's an independent political analyst, and Tony Gomes, President of Business and Professional Women in South Africa. And joining us from our Pretoria studios, Dr. Somadoda Figeni, who is also a political analyst. Welcome to the show. Dr. Figeni, let me just start right away with you. Another conference. Will this be another week wasted, which could have been used otherwise, perhaps to resolve Africa's problems? Because chances are not much is going to be decided which hasn't been spoken of.
Well, I do think that African Union has a mixed record. In some instances, in a conference like this one, they may decide to give a go-ahead to the West African nations to form up a special task force to deal with Boko Haram. So to that extent, you do have a very direct, responsive action and decision that is followed up almost immediately to deal with the security threat. But on grand gestures and pronouncements such as this is the year of women empowerment, they almost mean very little because there is no monitoring mechanism. Even the peer review system seem to have slowed down, which would track what has been done about some of the pronouncements.
Now, does a Mama Lesela in Pitsidi Sulejang have to be excited that this year has been declared the year of women empowerment or development?
Not necessarily. She should spend more time looking at the state of the nation as well as the budget in her respective country rather than continental pronouncements. Whether it's the European Union or the African Union, those broad continental pronouncements usually are very difficult to follow or implement, if at all. Some countries are more committed than others in following those. So a woman in a given country would be more excited when the government in that country begin to say, taking from the African Union decision, this is what we're going to do, and this is what we've budgeted for this year or for next year.
And Aisha, the political climate, does it allow for the achievement of this year of women's empowerment and development?
Well, I think, if you're talking about the political climate across the continent, certainly in hotspots like West Africa, due to both the Boko Haram insurgency and the Ebola outbreak there, certainly in Kenya and Somalia, with the uprise of Al-Shabaab there and the increasing strength of groups such as Al-Shabaab, it's very difficult to focus on something as nebulous as women's empowerment when you have very, very more immediate threats to national security and to citizen safety. So it becomes almost something that's given lots of airtime, lots of talk shops, lots of policy papers, but very little action. And over the last decade, we've seen that, the statistics have remained pretty stable on the negative side, if you will. So, there's a lot spoken, for example, about improving women's literacy and education for girls.
Yes.
Some progress has been made in that sector, specifically given the 2015 Millennium Development Goal. So there's been some progress on that level. In terms of progress for women, in terms of access to land, in terms of access to capital, very little progress still. In terms of ensuring that gender discriminatory laws and practices are abolished, again, very little progress.
Yes. But the funny thing is that besides the girls that were abducted in Nigeria, you also have other projections that Africa is going to be the leading country with children who are regarded as brides and all that, who are forced into marriages.
Trafficked?
Yes, actually, yes. Child brides, if one may call them that. Now, and then you have a year that you declare that it's going to be a year of women empowerment and development, when actually, they're saying here, I'll just quote you what Nyaradzai Gumbo Zwanda says, who is an AU Goodwill Ambassador for ending child marriage. Every year, about 15 million adolescent and teenage girls are married around the world, always forced into arrangement by their parents. Africa will become the region with the highest number of child brides in the world. Yeah.
It's a shocking statistic. And all I can say to that is, in order to change what is often deeply embedded cultural practice and traditional practice, the easiest and shortest way to change that is to increase the number of women who are educated to an increasingly higher standard, and to put economic power, decision-making power, and that's largely economic power, into more women's hands. And the way to achieve that is to give women access to capital and access to land.
Tony, that should be a good note to bring you in there. Access to capital, access to land. You are in charge of business and professional women, South Africa. How do you fit into this type of a summit? For instance, what becomes your view in as far as this theme is concerned?
Look, we work very closely with the UN, because we work with the Women's Empowerment Principles, which they established some years ago. But, to be very honest with you, there are so many different policy documents and all sorts of things that come out. UN's got so many, AU has them, they're everywhere. There's no one document that is set that one can say, okay, this is what we're going to do. So you almost have to choose, what are you going to be looking at, and forget the rest. That is the reality of the matter. And I think there's so much talking and not enough doing. And that for me is hugely problematic. If we were starting to do things, we wouldn't be having as many problems as we have now. Look how long the Boko Haram has been going on. What have we done? What have we done? Look, I understand that the AU cannot simply go in. It has to be invited in by the particular government, etc. But maybe we need to be putting some pressure on that government and saying, invite the AU in so that we can come and sort this out. I think it's an absolute disgrace that we have reached this point that we have, and nothing is happening.
Okay, hold the thought there. I want us to take a quick break. When we return, let's look at this Africa Agenda 2016, or rather 2063. This is Question Time. Please don't go away.
Zoom into Africa. This is Ghana, The president is Mr. John Dramani Mahama. Ghana got independent from the United Kingdom on 6 March in 1957. The population is more than 25 million people. One of Ghana's major languages spoken is English. Monetary unit is cedi.
SABC, sharing 20 years of inspiration.
Welcome back. You're still watching Question Time. My guest today, Aisha Kajis, an independent political analyst, and Tony Gomes, president of Business and Professional Women South Africa. And joining us from our Pretoria studios is Dr. Somado Dafigeni, who's also a political analyst. And Dr. Dafigeni, let me just come straight to you back. And the 2063 agenda, Africa Agenda 2063, borderless continent, cut off women should be in parliament. Are these things that we should be worrying ourselves in 2015, or perhaps shouldn't we be concerning ourselves about the immediate needs of people who are still alive at this point in time?
Well, there is nothing really wrong with having a long-term vision. Remember that even countries like China, they are where they are now because of the long-term vision they had in 1978. But what is key is how to monitor that process and make sure that you break it down into different chunks, maybe of 5 years, and each time you do have a technical team that will look as to whether the countries are complying with that, where they need assistance, what kind of interventions are there. That would be a lot more practical in a sense. But let's not forget, though, that a continental approach which constitutes 53 countries or more is a very complex exercise. It's one thing to have a vision which is brought about by the continental body. It's another thing to have the commitment by leaders. Sometimes those leaders who take decisions go to elections, they lose elections within 2 years. And the people who come thereafter may not prioritize these.
Yes. You see, the reason why I'm asking this is because you have the brains behind this being Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, right? And her term ends next year. Chances are she may not be going back because, truth be told, her stay has not been the most peaceful. You know, she has really had it tough up there. You've got a continent which is divided, Arabic, French, Anglophone, and all that. Now, how possible is it to then achieve such goals when you have such immediate challenges?
Actually, I do think that the immediate challenges that we see should not be reasons for us to be pessimistic. Remember that the European Union emerged from a continent that saw the bloodiest wars, which took tens of millions of people. And many people never thought that it would have some degree of stability and some common values. Not that it is a perfect, system. But look at the current Africa Rising narrative today. Africa today has massive resource reserves, and many countries are discovering oil, discovering minerals. It has the largest arable land when you compare it with the other continents, and the growth rate is relatively high, albeit from a low base for most countries. You go to many places, Dar es Salaam is one of the fastest growing cities. Ethiopia is having its Renaissance Dam, and you see Mozambique next door having discovered oil and gas as well, yes. Ghana and so forth. But you also have instances such as in the Arab North regions. The Arab Spring has left not only the African Arab North, but also the Middle East itself staggering, in a sense, where you may have a threat of failed states. But overall, though, when you look back at the time when there were no good news at all. In the 80s, Africa strangled by the IMF policies, poverty, and all Africa could deal with was foreign aid. Right now, it's beginning to attract major investors, old and new economies, look upon Africa for the resources they need. So we can't write it off. It will depend on the collective of the leadership, on how they take all those forward.
This would take a serious effort in ensuring that there are opportunities for women and girls, rather, not girl
young
children.
people generally.
Yeah, and education becomes the number one on the list.
Yeah, very much so. Without improving not only access to education, although that's of course the first step, but also the quality of education and tailoring the type of education our young people are getting to what is going to be demanded of them in the future. So I'm not necessarily saying tailor the education to the market, but I'm saying looking at the growth curves of successful countries, you find that one of the things they've done successfully is to actually project, forecast, if you will, become prophets as to what is going to be needed in 20 years' time, and then try to direct educational quality towards those sectors, and also, of course, to get more numbers into those sectors, so you get more graduates or skilled people or artisans or whatever is needed in whichever sector is coming out at the right time, in the right numbers, to fulfill the gaps that will appear. And when that happens successfully, then of course your economy takes off, because you have the skills in-house, inside the country, instead of needing to bring them in from elsewhere.
What is the state of professional women on the continent? How ready are you to take part on a serious note to ensure that you really determine the agenda, the 2063? This agenda includes your voice.
I think, first of all, we probably need to look to the private sector to help us push this through. Because I think from a government perspective, the red tape is so slow, the whole process is so terribly slow that we could still be waiting for action 10 years from now. I think we need to ask the private sector to help us. And in that respect, we train women into senior leadership positions in order to be ambassadors for us, so that they can then also bring women up through the ladder as well. So certainly in South Africa, I think we're quite privileged in that we have those women available. We do. Some countries may not, and I think different areas or different types of things are going to be relevant to different countries. A war-torn country is not going to care about some of the things that we might find important in South Africa. So to come up with one agenda for this, I think is quite problematic. It's bigger than that. And I think each country needs to perhaps look at their own, but, overall have different things, and each one choose what works for them.
Okay, I want us to talk about what will stop, or what are the risks that may border the achievement of the African Agenda 2060. Let me just take a quick break, Dr. Figen. When we come back, I will just come directly to you. This question time, please don't go away.
Had there been harmony between the South African government and the Nigerian government, which came through in the latter stages, the bodies would have been repatriated quicker.
Now, we always get a lot of criticism as a public broadcaster, but just how far can media go in terms of reporting the facts?
Watch Media Monitor Sundays at 9 a.m. on the SABC News Channel.
SABC, sharing 20 years of inspiration.
Welcome back. You're still watching Question Time. My guests today, Aisha Kaji, Tommy Gomez, and Dr. Somadoda Figeni. Dr. Figeni, let me allow you time to just finish off the point that you wanted to raise.
Yes, I think my colleague who spoke last on the issue of looking at Tony at the private sector, the real evidence that we see across the continent on women empowerment, unfortunately, the private sector has not been the best example. Look at South Africa, the public sector and the private sector empowerment of women, representation of women in parliament, in the cabinet, as mayors, and in some as DGs and so forth, has been quite faster than the corporate sector. In the corporate sector, there seemed to be a very slow response, primarily because the private sector would be looking primarily at profit making more than anything. In Rwanda, the same thing. And you can look across where there is political will and the right policy framework, which also regulates the private sector to empower women and incentivize it. Then that's only then that the private sector responds effectively.
What are the
but
challenges?
On its own,
what are the challenges, Dr. Figeni, that would hamper the achievement of Africa Agenda 2063, for instance?
Well, one of them would be weak leadership, where there are no visionary leaders who are driven by conviction, deep conviction of this common Africa, more integrated and having achieved Agenda 2063. And secondly, the weakness of states which have to do that, as well as the instability, the security system, as was said earlier, that sometimes states tend to be more concerned with the most immediate of issues. But one doesn't think that you will always have Egypt or north parts of Nigeria or Libya and many other countries which are experiencing instability like Somalia. One doesn't think that in 10, 20 years they will always be in that space.
Okay. Aisha, the challenges that you see hampering the achievements of this goals?
Poor literacy and education, and lack of food and health security. Those are big issues for women. Added to that, I've said also that there's barriers to accessing very, very important things such as capital and land. Just one statistic, if I may. More than 80% of the continent's food is produced by women who own less than, I think, 6% of its land. You know, now imagine if they had that economic empowerment of owning the land from which they produce. Most of the work they do on the land currently is unpaid labor. And the income from that, where there is income, very rarely comes back to those women. It's spent by men generally in those communities. If we were to change just that, we'd make a huge change.
Why can't you change?
Why can't we change it? Lack of political will, lots of very deeply embedded patriarchal custom and culture, things that essentially still laws or customs, even if they're traditional laws, that still reduce women to the role of chattel, possession, vulnerable to attack, both physical and otherwise. Laws that, for example, or practices that say that when a woman is widowed, the land that she's been working on to feed her family and her children, she's suddenly dispossessed of because she doesn't own that land.
But you see, those countries that we're talking about on this continent, they hold regular elections, right? And the majority of citizens are women there. And it is the same women who go and elect an Mpo, who is a male, you know. And then you want to come back and cry foul that the same man is oppressing us.
I think the mistake you're falling into, Mpo, is the mistake of thinking that elections equal democracy. They don't. They're only the first step.
Okay.
And if you've got a population, male or female, that is not sufficiently well educated, and I don't necessarily mean formal education.
Yeah.
I mean educated in terms of civic education,
Yes.
as to what the issues of the day are and what the different candidates stand for, then they're vulnerable to co-option by things such as, oh, we'll give you a bag of maize meal, or we'll give you free fertilizer and seeds this year if you vote for us. And unfortunately, that's the status quo. And of course, they're still also vulnerable to things like ethnic persuasion, tribal persuasion, religious sectarianism, linguistic sectarianism, etc.
Tony,
Much like in South Africa, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Very much the same, yeah. I think also for me, one of the big issues is the sexual violence.
Yes.
And I was watching Davos, where they had the UN amongst Melinda Gates and so on, with some corporates chatting about Africa as a whole and the plans for it. And, to be known as, well, South Africa has a really violent sexual problem and rape problem, doesn't it? It's kind of embarrassing, but actually true. But it's not just South Africa, it's Africa. And I think that, for me, is a big issue that we really need to look at. In Davos, that was actually quite one of the big issues that they were talking about. Also, they were looking at IT and how much IT can actually help women in rural areas. It is actually phenomenal what this can do. And the Gates Foundation is putting so much into that in Africa. And I think if other corporates or even governments could follow suit and see what they're doing, because they've done it for so long now, they've made mistakes and they've learned from them. That is a program that can really, really go far and really help lots and lots of women. It's an amazing program.
Okay. Hold the thought there. Dr. Afigani, let me give you the final or the closing thought here. Davos normally attracts international attention. The African Union, so far, we haven't seen, all the hype. Is it a lesser gathering?
Well, it's lesser in a sense that Africa comes from a deficit of being considered less in many ways. Slavery, colonialism, racial prejudice has done so. Look at 200 women and additional, scores of women taken from northern Nigeria. And look at 14 people killed in France. Where was the attention? The difference is so vast and big. That's why I do think that Africa itself, of course, working with all the progressive people from around the world, should also deal with the prejudice which are embedded over the centuries on, whether Africa matters or not in the world affairs, and whether it has contributed to the civilization of humanity. That in itself, to me, is fundamental, and it would be also the way of dealing with the embedded patriarchy, which is not only confined to the African continent, by the way, right across the world.
All right. Dr. Sumara Afigani, thank you very much. Aisha Kaji and Tony Combs, thank you very much for the time. That was Question Time for today. Question Time at sabc.co.za is our email address. Our Twitter handle at Question Time. You can also follow me on Twitter at @MportSedu. From me and the crew, have yourself a wonderful time. Goodbye.
A very good evening to you. Welcome to Business Review. An election in Greece yesterday has changed the face of Europe today, raising lots of questions about the future of the Euro bloc. We'll look at that and load shedding at home. First, a quick look at today's top news stories. The death toll rises as attacks on foreign-owned shops continue to spread. Condemnation from the ANC's National Executive Committee following yesterday's bloody clashes between the ANC and the SACP in Mpumalanga. Police are now investigating a charge of assault.